Amazon's free cash flow fell 71% in the fourth quarter of 2025. In the same earnings call, the company announced it would spend $200 billion on infrastructure the following year. Two numbers, same report. They do not belong together. For a decade, AWS was not just a division, it was the financial premise of the entire company. The warehouses, the shipping network, the video content, the Prime ecosystem, none of it made standalone sense. AWS made it make sense. Every quarter, the cloud generated operating income that subsidized everything else. In 2024, Amazon's free cash flow reached $32.9 billion. The machine was working at full power. Then capital expenditures consumed 94.5% of operating cash flow across 2025. Full-year free cash flow fell to $7.7 billion. AWS still generates over $11 billion in operating income per quarter. The headlines report that number first. The market prices it as the story. Free cash flow is what remains after everything the company is building has been paid for. In 2025, almost nothing remained. The operating income is real. The CapEx is also real. In 2025, those two things stopped moving together. AWS prints income. Amazon prints debt. If operations are no longer covering the build, the money has to come from somewhere. In November 2025, Amazon returned to the US dollar bond market for the first time in 3 years, raising $15 billion in a single offering. Long-term debt reached $119.1 billion by the first quarter of 2026, nearly double the prior year. The company's own SEC filing disclosed in plain language that Amazon may need to raise additional equity and debt as the build-out continues. Moody's flagged that the retained cash flow to debt ratio, which stood at 87% at the end of 2024, was approaching the 50% threshold that would trigger a review of its A1 credit rating. A downgrade raises borrowing costs. Higher borrowing costs compress margins already compressed by CapEx. The cycle applies pressure from both ends simultaneously. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you already know we don't do surface-level takes here. We follow the money until it stops making sense. Subscribe and turn on notifications because the next few minutes are going to take this further than most people are willing to go. The official justification for $200 billion is demand. Amazon has a reported cloud backlog of $200 billion. The demand signals are described as strong and clear. That argument requires believing in the customers generating those signals. One of the most significant is Anthropic. Amazon committed up to $33 billion in total investment to Anthropic, building on $8 billion deployed between 2023 and 2025. Anthropic, in return, committed to spending more than $100 billion on AWS technologies over the next 10 years. The money left Amazon as equity. It is returning as cloud revenue. Amazon's third quarter 2025 SEC filing recorded $9.5 billion in pre-tax gains from the Anthropic stake as non-operating income, unrealized paper gains from a company whose capacity to spend anything depends on capital Amazon provided. The appreciation appeared in reported earnings. The cloud commitments appear in the backlog. The same dollar is being counted in two separate columns, on two separate lines, as two separate proofs of health. The investment went out, the revenue came back, Amazon counted both legs as separate growth signals. That architecture is not unique to Anthropic. It is the operating logic of the entire cycle. NVIDIA invested in more than 50 AI startups in 2024 alone. Those startups spend on GPU compute. NVIDIA counts the demand. Microsoft anchored OpenAI with billions in capital and cloud commitments. OpenAI spends on Azure. Microsoft counts the contracts. Financial journalists and analysts flagged the pattern explicitly as circular financing before the end of 2025. The circularity has been described in analyst reports, documented in filings, named in published financial press. The industry built demand partly by financing the entities that would generate it, then treating that spending as independent market validation. Across all major hyperscalers in 2025, AI-related services generated an estimated $25 billion in revenue against more than $250 billion in infrastructure spending. $10 spent for every dollar returned. Goldman Sachs projected total hyperscaler capex from 2025 through 2027 at $1.15 trillion, more than double everything spent in the 3 prior years combined. Only about a quarter of enterprise AI initiatives delivered their expected return on investment in 2025, fewer than 20% scaled across full organizations. The demand the build-out was constructed to serve had not materialized. What had materialized was demand the infrastructure companies funded into existence and then counted as proof the infrastructure was necessary. The debt holding this together is not a niche concern. The top 5 hyperscalers raised $108 billion in new debt in 2025, more than 3 times their average annual issuance over the prior 9 years. Morgan Stanley projected approximately $400 billion in new technology sector debt issuance in 2026. Total projected AI infrastructure debt through 2028 was estimated at $1.5 trillion. Credit sites described capital intensity ratios at 45 to 57% of revenue as historically unthinkable. Some financing has migrated entirely off balance sheets through special purpose vehicles that analysts in IEEE-reviewed publications compared to structures associated with Enron. The investment-grade credit ratings are intact. Global Crossing had investment-grade ratings in 1999. WorldCom had analyst support and manageable ratios for most of the decade before filing what was then the largest bankruptcy in American history. They borrowed against demand projections their own ecosystem had partially manufactured, and the ratings held until the cycle turned. In March 2000, Cisco Systems was the most valuable company on Earth, market cap exceeding $500 billion. More than 70% of the global market for high-performance networking equipment. Everything that touched the internet needed Cisco hardware to function. The revenue was not fabricated, the growth was real, the demand projections were not. The telecom carriers placing Cisco's largest orders had borrowed billions against subscriber curves that never arrived. When those projections failed, the orders stopped. Cisco's market value fell approximately 90%. It did not return to its March 2000 peak until December 2025, 25 years later. The fiber those carriers laid still carries most of the world's internet traffic today. The infrastructure outlasted the companies. The companies did not outlast the fantasy priced into their valuations. AWS is in the same structural position Cisco held. Dominant infrastructure provider, essential layer, the indispensable node. The key difference is that AWS has real, substantial revenue from enterprises not primarily burning venture capital. The key similarity is that a meaningful portion of the demand signal justifying the build-out is generated by the same financial system paying for it. The Cisco customers were borrowing against subscriber projections. The AI companies in 2025 are spending capital provided by the hyperscalers on infrastructure owned by the hyperscalers, while the hyperscalers count those transactions as external validation of demand. The structure is different, the pattern is not. If this is landing differently than the usual takes you see on Amazon, that's because it is. Hit subscribe. This is the kind of analysis we run every week, and the next video already has receipts that are harder than these. Morgan Stanley projected Amazon's 2026 free cash flow at negative $17 billion. Bank of America estimated a deficit of $28 billion. The gap between those projections reflects uncertainty about timing, not direction. On the Q4 2025 earnings call, the CFO offered no payback timeline, no floor for free cash flow, no defined threshold at which spending would stabilize. The guidance was that demand signals justify the pace. The demand signals include $100 billion in commitments from a company Amazon funded, whose $9.5 billion in unrealized gains Amazon reported in its own earnings. Amazon is a top 5 holding in the S&P 500, alongside Apple, Nvidia, Microsoft, and Meta. The top 10 holdings in the Vanguard S&P 500 ETF represent 37.6% of the fund's total weight. That fund holds $1.5 trillion in assets. Fidelity's equivalent is a default enrollment option in 401 KEK plans held by millions of American workers. Morgan Stanley's Lisa Shallett reported that 75% of S&P 500 gains, 80% of its aggregate profits, and 90% of its capital expenditure were tied to AI as of late 2025. No one who put money into a standard retirement account chose to make a directional bet on Amazon's $200 billion infrastructure wager or on the circular financing structures underneath it. They chose an index. The index chose Amazon for them. The concentration is not a disclosure, it is a default. When Cisco's valuation fell 90% after 2000, pension funds and retail investors absorbed those losses. The fiber stayed in the ground. The workers who had built the infrastructure, staffed the carriers, processed the equipment orders most, did not recover those specific positions. The industry that emerged from the rubble was a different industry. It was built on cheaper bandwidth, employed different people in different roles, and had no particular obligation to the workers the previous cycle had displaced. Amazon cut 27,000 workers between 2022 and 2023. In October 2025, it announced 14,000 more, the largest single round of corporate layoffs in the company's history. In January 2026, it announced 16,000 more, 30,000 positions removed in roughly 90 days, approximately 10% of the corporate and technical workforce. Andy Jassy wrote publicly in June 2025 that the AI-driven efficiency push would produce a company that needs fewer people performing the roles being performed today. State WARN filings documented the specifics. A facility in Buffalo, 542 jobs. Long Island, 44. Nassau County, 71. Regulatory filings, not projections. The company borrowing $15 billion to build servers eliminated by legal notice hundreds of positions in communities that had organized around them. The $200 billion and the 30,000 layoffs are not separate strategic decisions. They are the same decision made in two directions on the same balance sheet. Even after all of this, the debt, the layoffs, the circular structures, the vanishing free cash flow, AWS is still losing cloud growth share. In the second quarter of 2025, Azure grew 39%. Google Cloud grew 63% in recent quarterly comparisons. AWS grew between 17 and 20% across 2025, its slowest rate in years. The company spending the most, borrowing the most, cutting the most is not widening its lead. The gap between what is being spent and what is being won is narrowing in the wrong direction. The data centers under construction in Indiana will almost certainly process workloads in 2035. The custom chips being installed across facilities in the United States, Asia, and Europe will run real jobs for real customers. The fiber laid during the telecom overbuild of the late 1990s still underpins most of global internet infrastructure. It outlasted every company that financed it. It outlasted every executive who projected the demand curves. It outlasted the investors who believed them. The infrastructure from those collapsed companies became cheaper after the crash, and a different generation built something durable on top of what the failures had left behind. The servers Amazon is building will survive whatever comes next. What may not survive is the accounting structure assembled to justify them. A $200 billion annual spend, debt financed against demand that is partly circular, counted partly as revenue and partly as unrealized investment gains, embedded inside the retirement accounts of people who only wanted a diversified index. That is not the technology. It is the story told to sell the technology to the market. The story can break without the technology breaking. The cable stayed in the ground in 2002. The carriers did not. The infrastructure will almost certainly work. The ledger built around it is the fragile part, and if you've made it this far, you already know most people watching Amazon headlines have no idea that ledger exists. Subscribe so you don't miss what we find next.